Hey guys, we're here today announcing the debut of the Banlist Battlers League's Guides website. This site, of course, is going to be at banlistbattlersleague.com. The link will be down in the description. So if you want to click on any of these guides for yourself and get a more in-depth look, I'll be updating these across the day today as of posting this, making it a bit more visually appealing. But I wanted to at least get the video out there, of course, to one, announce that we have BBL apps starting up. Well, actually, they've been out for a while. BBL apps close in like 2 days. Actually, they close at the end of Thursday. So if you're watching this, I know this is a little bit late, but reminder, go apply, description below. But also just, of course, to, get a guide out there to really try and help new players who might be doing their first Uber's Draft League, especially towards the end of the generation when a lot of different standard formats get a bit stale, in my opinion. This is typically a time when people will try and most likely look for those new formats, and I want to help them out. So I actually got this idea from my good pal Burgo. Burgo was going to make this into a Google Doc. I didn't really like, well, it was actually like a literal Google Doc. It wasn't even like a Google Sheets. And I didn't really like how the layout was, just because it was all on one page and it just felt very daunting to look at. I love the idea though, so I offered to actually make the website for Burgo. So shout outs to Burgo, of course. Had a couple people help me out with just generally learning WordPress and all that, but I made a very, very bare bones website. Obviously, again, this will be updated down the road. We're gonna try and include some more things, such as like just general viability rankings of certain like top Ubers. We'll try and get some guides in, etc., etc. Like the guides isn't like specifically like specific to each Pokemon and what makes it good, what partners to use. But I wanted to at least get the general like role compendium part of it out of the way because I felt like that was the easiest one to explain. So for anyone who might be new to Ubers, for one, welcome. And two, there are a bit of things that do definitely change from the Uber's draft setting versus the standard draft setting. And I kind of wanted to take today to go over that and show some of the points on the website and just generally what we cover right now while doing that. Because I felt like that's an important starting ground for anyone looking to actually do their first Uber's Draft League and do pretty well. So let's start off, of course, with the hazard removal. So hazard removal in Ubers is a bit different because you want to make sure that your hazard removal can do a couple things. For one, typically I feel like the defog is a fairly valuable option here because a lot of the spinners just really don't stack up, and we'll get into that in a bit. I've settled this into a lot of different aspects, but for one though, I did want to start with primary defoggers. Now these are defog options that, in my opinion, can pretty consistently click defog, or at the very least just in general keep hazards away. As for some of the mons here, I can go into why I included them, for at least some of the little bit more harder to justify ones. But stuff like Empoleon, for example, it's a defog option that also doesn't necessarily just get outright massacred by stuff like Dragons or Xerneas. So I felt like to include it here. Xatu obviously, has the benefit of stuff like Magic Bounce, which is pretty useful when keeping hazards away in general in this format. We obviously have, the typical standard defoggers, stuff like, Noivern, Thunderous Form, especially Incarnate, I should say, Finny, Talonflame, etc. The mons that you typically will see people run defog on standard, and most of these do actually hold up as far as defoggers go. We also do have some, of course, Ubers editions such as Giratina Forms and Ho-Oh. These are amazing defoggers as far as Ubers mons go. Mega Salamence is a pretty not bad one. At the very least, I would at least be okay with having it as a defog option if I needed it to, because typically you just need one attack and then like Roost. You also have stuff like, of course, the Mega Scizors, which these are pretty amazing Pokemon as well in this format. Mega Scizor in particular is actually a really top tier Pokemon in this format as far as like non-Ubers goes. It's probably one of the best you can really get for non-Ubers Pokemon. We obviously do also have our backup defoggers. Now this includes some Pokemon that are really good at defogging, and obviously as well some Pokemon that, while they can defog, don't necessarily want to. This being, for example, stuff like Arceus forms. Most Arceus typically don't want to force defog every week, or at least they don't want to be your primary response. Like, for example, if I have maybe like a Thunderous plus an Arceus form, I can at least prankster defog in that, because Thunderous won't really break as well in this sort of format against a lot of the dragons in general, or stuff like Groudon and Pedon. But I can maybe make that be my defogger with prankster, and then allow Arceus to be more of a win con. It's still not a back defog mon by any sense, but typically I don't want to make it my defog mon 6 out of 8 weeks. Stuff like Ray as well fits in here, which get into a bit more niche defog territory, but they still at least can put on offensive pressure to allow themselves to defog. Same for stuff like Reshiram and Zekrom. We have obviously stuff like Xerneas, which Xerneas gets on here mostly because if you're running a choice set, you typically just need Moonblast plus coverage for whatever the Xern switching is. That's really it. So just a lot of stuff like down here, obviously. These are the mons that, if you were to have something in the primary range, I would say are fine extra defog options. None of them are going to carry on their own, though, in my opinion. Next up, though, we do get the rapid spinners. As I said, a lot of the rapid spinners don't hold up. There was literally not enough to actually make their own primary tier for it, so I didn't really go with it. But we have stuff like Drill. Obviously, Drill is the far and away best best rapid spinner here in the tier. We have stuff like Tentacruel as well, obviously, which Tentacruel is not bad by any sense. Just, you know, T-Spikes are pretty appreciated, and especially with Tentacruel going down a lot in cost, it's become a bit more viable. We also do have more of our offensive defoggers, though, at least because Drill can be a support mod. It can also be an offensive one, but stuff like Lecky, Pheromosa, etc., which are getting rapid spins off because of the fact that they're actually forcing a switch, these are still pretty good options in Ubers, because typically, especially with stuff like a Lecky, you're forcing in the ground type, and you go for rapid spin and then bring in another Uber. Albeit, I wouldn't really draft a Lecky unless you're getting like a rain team, but it still is an option. We also have, obviously, stuff like Pheromosa, which does force a lot of switches at the very least, just because it's so obnoxious to take a hit from. So when you're then getting a free rapid spin turn off of that into maybe a U-turn out on whatever the check is, it's pretty useful in my opinion in this format. We do have some other stuff like Fortress and Donphan, obviously, you know, with Sturdy. They're not horrible, but I won't act like they're great either. Obviously, again, really just team preference here, but I'm just listing through a few and why they're here. I did also want to cover spin blockers in this category. This was a little bit of one I just didn't really know where to put it, but I figured at least it kind of fit, because if nothing else, at least stops the opponent from removing hazards. So this is sort of like the antithesis to the rapid spin Pokemon, so I put it right below. We do have stuff like Lunala and Domings in this tier, for example, fairly bulky ghosts in the Ubers format. But we also have some of our more offensive Ubers, stuff like Dragapult and Clerics Shadow, which, while they're not necessarily going to be taking a hit from necessarily every rapid spin option, they can definitely come in on stuff like, for example, Excadrill, and you can just get a pretty free ghost hit, especially if you're like a Spectacularex and you've got a bit of damage on Drill. You just go for Astral Barrage and force it out, because you could switch that in on a rapid spin turn, then it can't really do anything. Or B, if Drill maybe, let's say, needs to clear hazards on a given turn and you've just lost a Pokemon, you can then go into Calyrex, and again, you can make sure that Drill doesn't get the hazards removed. So some of these frailer options are still fairly viable. We obviously have, you know, the Arceus Ghost, which is probably like as good as you can get for an Uber's Spin Blocker Bar and Giratina forms. We have Mega Sableye, which Mega Sableye also just a generally better mod in this format. I know Mega Sableye in general has fallen off a bit in draft as of recent, or really as the past few years, but Mega Sableye does really good, especially with a lot of bulkier teams and stuff like Lugia, for example. It's a pretty good Dark too. But in general, these are some pretty good spin blockers for whether offensive or defensive purposes. I tried to include some budget in this range too, because Ghost in general is a pretty limited tier, but stuff like Mischievous, if you're looking at that 1 point range, same as Deblade and Corsa like Galar, all again pretty good 1 point options. And that's another thing I do actually want to mention here too. When the actual draft happens for BBL in a couple days, this will by then be sorted based on price. But for the moment, I just threw the mods on here regardless of order. But they'll be sorted from highest to lowest. That way, then if you're looking for something, let's say you know that Arceus is just off the board and Giratina forms are just too expensive for your draft. Well, you could look a little bit over to the side of Giratina, and you might see something like a Jellicent or a Spectria or a Spiritomb. And it really, at that point, you do have to use a little bit of obviously critical thinking here to figure out what one fits best. But I did want to mention that obviously, because we do have stuff sort of thrown all over the place in this tier. You know, stuff like Sableye, Mega Sableye next to Spectria, for example. So I did just want to preface that while the thought was in my head. But yeah, so finally we obviously get into others. These are Pokemon that still deter hazards in some way. Really just Magic Bounce plus Scorching Cinderace. These Pokemon are all pretty average besides Mega Sableye, Mega DNC, and Cinderace. But even still, Cinderace is not necessarily going to be clicking Core Change a lot in this format, because it's meant to be a Libra one. We do get into hazard setters here. Setters, these are pretty important in my opinion, whether rocks, spikes, etc. Typically, at least for rockers, you want to still be able to force boots. I get that, you know, a lot of people don't really care about hazards as much as Gen because they can just throw boots on 6 Pokemon. But you do still need to actually force the opponent to consider that. Because if I only have, let's say, for example, like Golurk as a rocker, and that's my only rocker on the team, no one's going to be prepping for boots. Then no one's going to. It's just not a thing unless you're running maybe Ho and you're super worried about that Golurk matchup. Which even still, I don't know why you are. But we have some Pokemon here, obviously, though, like, for example, Dialga, Groudon, Primal Groudon, and Duskmane, all amazing Stealth Rock users. Some other varied Pokemon in this tier, stuff like, you know, the Uxie and Mesprit, they're amazing rockers. If realistically, this sort of Pokemon right here and the primary Stealth Rock users, I meant to rename this to primary Stealth Rock users, but regardless, so, basically, all of these Pokemon are Pokemon that if you were to have this and then, like, 1 or 2 other Stealth Rockers, you're pretty set with. If nothing else, whether your team goes for 10 Pokemon, whether it goes for 12, whether it goes for less even if you're doing like an 8 or 9 mon format, these are Pokemon you could actually rely on to consistently get up Stealth Rocks, in my opinion. Some more so than others, obviously, you know, like Groudon's an amazing Stealth Rocker, and it could really do it just in and out every single time. you could get rocks up like 5 times in a game if you had to. Whereas maybe something like Mesprit, you only get it up like once or twice, but it will at least get it up that once or twice. We get into our backup stealth rock users though. And these are some Pokemon that are still not bad. I wouldn't necessarily rely on them to be my rockers though, but you get into stuff like Infernape, which is pretty good sash lead with like Rock's Endeavor. You get into stuff like Blissey, which could typically just go for like some sort of cleric option with rocks. Same as Clefable for that matter, actually. I want to mention though, I did not put Chansey in here, and I want to put that in specifically as a mention because of the fact that I feel like Chansey is a little bit harder of a time with its move slot, because you really do need S-Toss on it. I know Blissey doesn't have the most special attack, but it's a pretty big difference, at least if nothing else. And also, obviously, as well, for other utility moves, I feel like personally, at least, Blissey could afford it better. And with rockers, at least I wasn't really worried about including a lot of options. So I felt like, personally, that Chansey was the one worth leaving off. Feel free to disagree. I did just want to mention that, obviously, before someone commented it. But we do have some other rockers, though, in general, in this range. Stuff like Miltank, which is, again, pretty good rocker. Just, I don't want to put Miltank as my team's main rocker when it does have a bit of move slot issues. Same as Mew. If Mew is your primary anything, by the way, you're doing your team wrong. A Mew is great at rocking. It is great at being a support mon. It's great at being a removal option. But if it is your primary anything, you're drafting your team wrong. So that's why Mew is in the backup rockers. We do some other stuff. Obviously, I mentioned Golduck here. As I said, you can't really draft Golduck because your only team's rocker. Just a thing. Same as stuff like Torterra, Piloswine, etc. All these lower tier rockers. So we have the Arceus forms, obviously, again, for some reasons for defog. Then we also have some good, like, just suicide leads down here. Stuff like the Arrow forms, specifically regular Arrow, especially a great, again, sash lead. Arrow's benefit especially, I know a lot of people, again, don't really use Arrow this gen, but Arrow does benefit a lot from being a fast taunt user to stop other leads, which is pretty cool. On top of also then, again, just being a really good rocker. We do still have some other, obviously, budget picks, stuff like Stunfisk, Crustle, etc. But yeah, again, a lot of good rock options here, in my opinion. We do have the spike options as well. Spike users, there's not a lot of, I'll be honest. The quality goes down really quick if you're not going to get a Deoxys form, Mew, or Greninjas. To be fair, there's some other ones, like for example, Naga's not a bad one, but it's just kind of like budget Gren in terms of the spike regard. Though it can still definitely do it, to be fair. You still have the Roserade and Roselia, obviously they're not terrible. Quillfish is not terrible. Getting into stuff like Pod, Scully's a little bit here and there depending on the draft. Chestnut, Sandslash, etc. Like, again, the quality is very different in Spikers. I don't think they're mandatory, personally, but they're definitely not bad to have on a team. I would probably gun for anything in that top row besides Cole or Fortress, and then like a Greninja, Naga, Roselia, Roserade, or Quillfish. And at that point, I wouldn't necessarily get Skarm as my spike user. I'd probably get as rock user, to be fair, but it's not a bad spike user either. Point being, though, is there's not a lot in this, but there's some stuff that can work if you're really looking for one. I have obviously toxic spike users next. Really few toxic spike users that are actually like usable in this format, but I tried to list anything just to really give any sort of variance of options, even as far as like 1 point range goes, because there's so few of them. So that's why stuff like Venomoth and the Weezings make it on here, even though they're not necessarily the greatest mons in this format. Same with stuff like Pincurchin, because again, not really a lot. But we do still have some actual good ones though. For example, Etern is an amazing toxic spike user. In fact, if you really want to get a bulky team, I feel like Etern round 1 is probably your pick. Just to, give some advice there. Nidos are still pretty good. Greninja specifically, not Ash Greninja. Ash Greninja does not get toxic spikes, no matter what Showdown will tell you. It validates as illegal. But there are some decent toxic spike users here though still. Pex obviously is a great one. We have stuff like Naganadel, which is a pretty good one. But yeah, so again, just going over some good toxic spike users. We do have Webs too. Webs, there's really not a lot, to the point where we actually listed even some NFE ones that have historically done well, namely being Dottler and Charjabug. But Webs, you really just do not need Webs, in my opinion. But if you, the exception would be if you're drafting something like a Rayquaza, or maybe like, really, honestly, if you're not getting Rayquaza or like some sort of really good Scarfer or just Spexmon, you don't need Webs, in my opinion. But if you want them, if you have like 1 point left over, there are worse things to invest your 1 point into at least, and these are all some pretty good ones. There's some other ones, for example, that you can obviously get like Swadloon, Kricketune, but they somehow do even less than any of these 10 mentioned. And I do have to preface that, even Charjabug, just for what it's worth, they do less, even than Charjabug, which at least has done something in this format, very loosely. Shout out to Lux. So had to give it a spot there. Obviously, we do some other options like Clerics, for example. Clerics are a bit quicker, but there's still some really good ones. Obviously, we have our status removers here. These are some pretty free mons to click Heal Bell or Aromatherapy with. We have some really good defensive ones, stuff like Audino Forms, Clefable, Blissey, Chansey, etc. We also have some good offensive ones too, stuff like, the Calyrexes and Xerneas, which typically, on at least choice sets, they can typically run Aromatherapy because they don't really need a lot of coverage. Clerics basically just needs steel coverage and then Glitch Lance. For Shadow Rider, you really just need the stabs coverage for dark, and then at that point you can run aromatherapy because you don't really need anything else. And Xerneas, you really just need Moonblast, fighting move, or psychic move, and then just aromatherapy or defog. So you do have some options to run it on these mons. I know that, to be fair, that a lot of people don't see Xerneas and think, oh my god, this can be my team's cleric. But you also don't really need a cleric in this format. There's not a lot that really, I would say, super loses to Toxic. Unless your team's really weak to something like Eternatus or Toxic Spikes in general. Cleric is a nice role to have, but it's not really mandatory in my opinion. But as I said, that's why you also don't need something that's going to be super consistent at clericing. You could just get something that can do it 1 or 2 games. Something like a Xerneas or a Clerics, or even on the lower end, something like a Comfey or a Weezing or something like that. But these are all kind of cool Pokemon to get, in my opinion, if you're really looking on the role, if you're really hard set on it. I would draft any of these. We do have Wish Users too, obviously. You know, stuff like obviously the evolutions, specifically the good evolutions, with stuff like Audino, Mega Audino, etc., etc. These are pretty much the same as Heal Bell users, just a lower list. Though we do have a couple standouts here actually that I like a lot. For one, Kang and Mega Kang, especially Mega Kang, is really actually pretty good in this format, especially for a Wish user that's not a cleric. If your team doesn't really mind the status, but you do want the Wish support for something maybe like a Groudon or a Dialga, it's a pretty good Wish user actually. Something as well that could be pretty useful would be something like a Salamence or a Rachi, depending on the tier that they end up in. I'm pretty sure Mence can end up at like 9-10 points. So that could actually be a pretty good Wish user for a team if you really need like a 100 base dragon. And also it's a good defog mon too. Which is sort of the thing with stuff like Mence and Kang. They're pretty good at like compressing Wish into other sets, which is nice. And as for Rachi, I mean, it's a pretty good Zern check on top of also just being a good Wish user, which is actually extremely useful for a lot of teams. There's some obviously really cliche stuff like the Lotties. We have stuff like Florges, Chansey, Blissey, etc. You can find some good users here. Again, not really a mandatory role. Healing support is even less mandatory, but again, listed some options here. You know, Cress is in here just because the Lunar Dance, but the rest are all Wish, Healing Wish, stuff like Indeedee, Gardevoir, Mecha Gardevoir, Hatterene, etc. Not really a lot to go over here. We do have one more interesting category, which goes into our weather users. Now, I want to preface, there will be some other categories down the line, stuff like, you know, really good breakers. We have some really good Scarf users, what we're going to do. I'm going to try and get a speed tier list as well for viable speed options, for stuff you should actually consider drafting for speed, etc., etc. You know, all those sort of guides that, like, a Smogon tier would have. I want to try and make them for this draft setting specifically. And again, there will be stuff ranging across the actual, like, the 45 to 1 point scale, but I do want to still list options nonetheless. But first, of course, I do want to go over weather in general. We do have rain. Rain is the first weather. We have some good weather sweepers. Rain is finally viable. For anyone who might be a BBL veteran, you would know that for the longest time, rain was a very unviable weather. However, if you're drafting Kyogre, it's pretty good. You know, Kyogre stocks are pretty high right now. You can get something like, for example, like Ludicolo Kingdra with Kyogre and be pretty fine. You really only need one or two of those Swift mons. In my personal opinion, actually, though, I wouldn't really get more than one of them, and it would probably be either Ludicolo or Kingdra, though there is merit for Hobbytops and Golurk, as well as Mega Swampert. But again, I feel like that if you're not getting Ludicolo or Kingdra, and then only one of them, plus maybe a good breaker like a Dracovish or Shifu, then you're kind of throwing, in my opinion. I believe that I actually did forget to put any of those rain breakers down there, though. I did actually forget to put the rain breakers down there. Okay, so other strong rain partners. This will be updated by the time you see it, but it's going to include some really good breakers as well. Stuff like, you know, Dracovish or Shifu Rapid, etc. But we do have some really good mons right now. We included, for example, obviously Hurricane abusers, so like Torn, Zapdos. That's really it. We have stuff like Zekrom and Helios that are pretty good Thunder abusers, especially with stuff like, you know, Helios obviously has coverage for grounds, and stuff like Surf can just get rain boosted. We have stuff like Raikou with Weather Ball. We have stuff like Thunderstorms as well with Weather Ball plus Thunder. So these are all really deadly, offensive, really good pressuring options to counter stuff that rain struggles with. In the Hurricane users' cases, that's more so Pokemon such as like grasses, maybe something like a Shaman, for example. And on the flip side, for the electric types, it's more for opposing water types. You know, maybe you're fighting Primal Kyogre in a given matchup. Or maybe you're fighting something a little bit more mundane, like maybe a Greninja form. Something like Coco, for example, could just go for a Scarf, well, for a Rain Boosted Thunder, and just nail it. But to be fair, Coco just nails it anyway, but more so just the point being to help with the rain matchups, that rain might at least take a little bit more time to kill. We do have some other good options here, though, for stuff that maybe defensively benefits from rain. Obviously, you know, Kyogre is a really good option just as far as the fact that it's a 4 times resist to rain. And on top of that as well, it's also pretty good for stuff like Groudon, which can at least try and set the sun and take advantage of a rain team. We have Gmolt, which is another Hurricane abuser. I forgot to actually list that with the others. Now we do have stuff, you know, that benefits defensively just from the fact that the rain makes fire do less damage. Stuff like, you know, the Scizor, Mega Scizor, which especially Mega Scizor, I actually do think is the better Mega in this format than Pert, but that's a discussion for another day. We do still have some other options though. If maybe Mega Scizor isn't your cup of tea, we still have stuff like Ferrothorn, which is an amazing hazard setter for rain, and then Genesectic Cortana, which are also some pretty good Scarf options for rain teams, since you still want the speed outside of just Swim. But regardless, though, we do have a couple other weathers to go over. We have, first things first, we have Sun teams. So Sun teams, we do have a little bit here, albeit I don't think that there's a lot here for Sun that actually does work. But I will say, to be fair, Sun also isn't necessarily locked into setting with Kyogre, because Kyogre is really the only viable rain setter. You're not getting Politoed, you're not getting Pelipper, unless you're maybe getting like a single rain option with it. You're not getting a rain team around that. You could, however, actually get a soft Sun core with either Groudon or Torkoal. I wouldn't really get Ninetales, but I mean, you could. And then go for one of these other options, in my opinion, or maybe even two of these other options. I will say, though, I include the Drought user in the 2 to 3 there. I had already mentioned that in the list as well, but I did want to mention that, of course, again. But maybe something like, you know, either regular Zard or Mega Zard X, or honestly, Charizard Y is also an okay Sun option. I know that, you know, typically you shouldn't get Megas as your setters, but at the same time, though, Sun's not really something you need 8 turns for, in my opinion. It's just something you need like 2 or 3. You do still have options like Venusaur and Mega Venusaur. Mega Venusaur's on here because of pre-Mega, you can Chlorophyll into then going for the bulky set once you kill the fast stuff. Mega Doom's amazing with Solar Power, especially being an offensive Dark type. It actually is a pretty good mon in this format, in my opinion. Heliolisk, again, just like with Rain, it benefits from Sun thanks to Solar Power, just like how Mega Doom did for this sort of core. Obviously, Shiftry, it's a weird Chlorophyll mod, to be fair. But Shiftry, at least being a Dark type as well, is pretty useful over something like a Victory Bell or a Vileplume, which just are budget Venusaurs. We have Victini, which is a pretty good... Basically, it just does the same thing as Megazord X in terms of being a Sun Breaker that isn't your Mega slot. And then it's also not your Uber slot as compared to stuff like Ho-Oh or Reshiram, which I will preface, I'd only get these if you're getting Groudon. If you're going to get Groudon, though, these are amazing options to follow up with, or even just Ho-Oh into Groudon if you're really lucky, but I don't think Ho-Oh Groudon's a realistic core, but if you get it, I mean, you should get it. We have Blaziken and Mega Blaziken, obviously, you know, for maybe a little bit more on the cheaper end of the Uber spectrum or the borderline Uber spectrum. And then Heatran, again, really good Sun option because you could always Flash Fire for potential Weather Ball stuff, or even just in general for other fire hits since Groudon's not actually a resist. And then also on top of that, you know, Scarfer option's really deadly. We do have one more weather though, or should I say two, and that is Hail and Sand. Don't draft either of these. They're terrible. Realistically, Drill is just a Sand Setter plus Trill. That's all it is. It's not a team. There's nothing I need to list here. All the Sand Setters work, to be honest. They're all pretty spaced out well for cost. Then Hail's Stororville, and then you shouldn't draft the Arctozolt, but if you're gonna draft the Sweeper, draft the Arctozolt. But don't draft a hard team for these. I don't want to see anyone thinking that it's a good idea to draft Exegel, Stoutland, Hippowdon with the setter being T-Tar. And I mentioned that specifically so you could run Sandforce Hippowdon. Don't do it. Do not do it. Don't also throw Gigalith on there as a Sandforce Pokemon. It's not going to work. Same for Hail. I could probably list like a Kyurem White, A9, Arctozolt, Arctovish, etc. team. Don't do it. It's just terrible. But hopefully you guys enjoyed though and learned something new today. As I said, I'm going to be updating this, but if you have any ideas that might be helpful for you in terms of things that you might want to know about this format or think a new player might want to know, comment down below your ideas. I'd love to add them to the site if they're good, and you might see them on here in the future. If you enjoyed this video though and want to see more just like this, leave a like below and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Until then, peace out guys.